Welcome back, everyone, to Neighbors in the Network. I'm James Pinedo, your host. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Tony Woodlief, the Senior Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow of Center for Practical Federalism at SPN. Tony, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, James.
It's a real pleasure. I have been researching a little bit this week about your past, and I have so many questions. And you need no introduction, but for those that might not be aware about some of the things you do, Tony is State Policy Network's Senior Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow for SPN's Center for Practical Federalism. He helps oversee SPN operations, supports SPN President and her guidance of the leadership team, and helps ensure the organization's projects and programs measure success, evolve as SPN grows, and maintain alignment with our vision and mission. So, Tony, that's a lot. And I'm wondering, can you help me break down? So, how did SPN's Center for Practical Federalism come about? Like that seems like it's so bold. I was thinking about practical. Oh my gosh, that's difficult. Like that has so many connotations for it. It means like it's actually like you're doing it. It's happening. And I was thinking, are you using Aristotle in the Aristotelian sense? Are you using practical in the Aristotelian sense? What does that mean? Tell me more about it.
Well, we wanted to differentiate. Well, how did it come about? I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, I guess, I wrote this book called I, Citizen, um, and in which I was just applying my old political science chops, to try to show through, there's just abundant data. It's very clear that average Americans are not ideologically driven. We're not on the verge of civil war between Team Red and Team Blue. Most people don't like either party all that much. For the first time recently, majority of Americans reported that they're not in either party. Um, so people are not partisan. Partisans are partisan, and unfortunately, partisans control, all the major institutions in this country, including the news media. So we're fed this steady diet of extreme wingnuts on both sides at each other's throats, owning each other on Twitter, that kind of thing. And it creates the impression that we're a country on the edge of civil war. And I also talked a little bit about, well, what do we know about what regular Americans, the 80% of the people who are not toxic ideologues, what do they want? And it turns out that they want a blend of policies in immigration, crime, taxes, social welfare spending, what have you, that neither party really wants to serve up to them. So that was sort of the first half of the book. And the second half of the book, I got more into, well, who benefits from this misportrayal of America as ideologically divided? Well, it's primarily politicians and their consultants and lackeys and enablers and operatives who occupy Washington, D.C., and who prefer to administer power undemocratically through courts and federal agencies. And so in the process of that, we realized internally at SPN, we had done so much work to try to enable our heroes out there in the network, all those people in state think tanks and other state groups, to achieve better policy in their state capitals. And we've seen great success there, but we realize if nobody halts the growth of federal agency power, they're going to turn every state into an administrative district of Washington, D.C. They're going to undo and undermine school choice, health freedom, healthcare freedom, all these things we're working on. They're going to undermine them, and so we got to do something. And then we decided, well, whereas traditionally the mindset has been the things of Washington must be dealt with in Washington, reality is there's a lot of power that state and local leaders have to oppose federal agency predation and overreach. And so that was the genesis of the center was, can we build some tools to make state and local elected officials aware of how federal agencies influence state and local decisions, often without any awareness on the part of elected officials? Can we make them aware and also show them things they can do legally to oppose federal overreach? And so that was why we started the center. It's essentially mobilize state and local federalism champions to defend their communities and try to restore a constitutional balance of power. So, federalism should be an SPN thing, And so that's what we're doing. And so why practical? Because so often when you hear federalism, especially if it's in the title of a group or a journal or something, it's theory, which is fine. I mean, that's important. Philosophy, a good philosophical grounding is very important. But we wanted to emphasize we're not going to have seminars talking about James Madison. Those are wonderful. Other people do that. We're going to focus on what practically can state and local leaders do to do federalism and to defend their communities. And so that's what we built.
And I'm guessing to feed that goal, the Federalism Scorecard is one of the things that you guys have developed. Can you tell me a little bit about we just released a new updated Federalism Scorecard. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was one of the first things we did because we thought, part of the challenge here is there's so many institutional rules of the game at the state level that govern the state-federal relationship. And a lot of those are rules that elected officials in the states don't pay a lot of attention to. And they evolved for various reasons. There's nothing nefarious there. But over time, federal agencies, as they expanded their unchecked power, they began to abuse those rules. And so what happened was state executive agencies, for example, became a primary vector for federal influence. And so we said, all right, let's catalog as best we can those state level laws and rules of the game and practices that make a state vulnerable to undue federal influence. And so we looked at stuff like, what are your state's rules governing who in your state is authorized to accept a federal grant and sign off on all the fine print that comes with that grant? And gosh, we found most states, the answer is some unelected member of the executive branch. There's no oversight, no genuine oversight by anyone that the state elected. And so that's an example of what we put in there. We look at stuff like, does the legislature in the state have an oversight committee that's active? Because if you don't even have an oversight committee, you're probably not doing a lot of oversight of those state agencies. And so we just looked at those things and then we ranked states. We assigned weights to those different variables, and that's all subjective. And we talk about that in the report and invite people to, assign different weights that they want. We're just trying to make them aware of these vulnerabilities. But we ranked the states on, all these variables, and, because people love to see a ranking. And we were pleasantly surprised to learn that it wasn't all the red states at the top, ranked the best and all the blue states at the bottom. There was a real nice mix, which just highlights that doing federalism is not a Republican versus Democrat issue. And there are really good reasons to have the reforms that put a state's legislature back in the driver's seat of that relationship with the federal government that anybody from any party should get behind. And in fact, my favorite example is the best law in the country, the best state law in the country, as far as governing, overseeing receipt of federal funds is in Oregon. And one of our, colleagues, Steve Johnson, who works with our team, he was a former chair of the Michigan House Oversight Committee. He called up the gal who chaired the committee in the Oregon legislature that reviews every proposal for a grant application. And this lady is fairly to the left, but in her view, well, this is just democracy. Of course, the elected representatives ought to review what the executive branch wants to bring money in for. And so that to me was just epitomized. Yes, this is not red versus blue. I would say it's not even conservative versus liberal so much. It's about democracy. A word my friends on the left like to use. It's about we the people being in charge. So anyway, that scorecard is just an effort to make especially state lawmakers, but state and local leaders aware of the vulnerability. And then, implied in that is a set of reforms that any of them could adopt. And so what we've been up to is we have a lot of conversations with state and local leaders where we help them think through what reforms might be best for their state, not just to give them a higher ranking, although that does come up, how do we get ahead of this state?
Hmm.
But so they can be just more in charge of that relationship and able to guard against undue federal influence.
Hmm. So would you say, if I'm translating what you just told me into very simple filmmaker terms, that's my background, so I have to be simple. Um, do you would you say that a higher score means that that state does democracy better?
It's a great question. I would say this is how I explain it to people. We're very careful to help our the consumers of this product understand we are not judging their state in the sense of saying, "Oh, this state's a better state. You'd rather live here than there." I urge them to think about it like your cholesterol score. You may have a high cholesterol score, and you can go out and run a marathon, but it's something you ought to keep an eye on because it's a potential vulnerability. Um, so there are states that have on paper a lot of the right rules that give maximum visibility to the legislature on engagements with the federal government. The legislature has to approve, certain actions vis-a-vis the federal government. That's all great, but it's kind of like my tool shed. There's a bunch of shiny tools out there that don't quite have the dirt and grime on them they probably should. So it doesn't matter what tools are in my tool shed. It matters more what's the path between my house and my tool shed look like? Is it worn? Is it overgrown? Um, and likewise, there are states that don't do well on this ranking. You take Texas, for example. They have a terrible score. Um, but I'm not going to sit here and say that Texas is unconcerned with federal overreach. I mean, golly, they're very active in their executive branch in particular in resisting federal overreach and federal failures of performance with the guarantee clause and things like that. So it's more an effort to say, look, party power changes. And so, yes, it's great if you've got elected officials who are concerned about the relationship with the federal government and they're jealously guarding the state's prerogatives. So important. But those rules of the game are what persist as parties and personalities come and
Hmm.
go.
Hmm.
And so it just is common sense to attend to the rules of the game because you can't always be confident that you'll have a courageous, federalism committed leader. Number
Hmm.
one. Number two, we've seen instances where, and I won't, I don't want to make anyone look bad. We've seen instances where there are notable state leaders. You'd know their name and you'd say, yeah, that guy or gal is really pro-federalism, doesn't trust the federal government one bit. But we flag stuff with our trackers. We identify stuff that the federal agencies are trying to push through their state agencies or through the Federal Register, and they didn't even know about it. So that is the other thing. If you don't have the right rules of the game, you just don't have the same visibility. So
Hmm.
part of that scorecard is saying, how clean is your windshield?
Hmm.
Because you may be a really good driver and you're committed to the destination you're going, but if your windshield is half covered with mud, you don't have the same odds of getting safely where you got to go.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something that really surprised me about when I looked at the scorecard. I fled California. I mean, I have many lovely friends that are still there in California, but California had a much higher score than Texas. And I was like, well, hang on, that seems surprising to me. Like I wouldn't think of, because I fled because of all the government overreach. Like I couldn't go to my church for a year, and that was a big deal for me. Um, so it really surprised me to see that, and I'm thinking, wow, well, how can we improve things? Are there some concrete? Can you give me a insight into when you're having these talks with people in different states who want to improve their score? What are some of the common things that you're saying? Like, okay, here's some good ideas for improvement.
Yeah. Well, let's pick up on California for a second because we'll publish soon. It's just a brief walkthrough of the first 48, 72 hours of President Trump's new term. We examined every executive order to identify the ones that have some kind of impact on federalism. And then we assess, is this good for federalism or not good for federalism? And it's a mixed bag. And one in particular, we look at, there's an executive order concerning flows of water through California and directing the relevant federal agencies to do what they can legally, of course, to send more water into Central and Southern California because California has made choices about releasing tons of water into the ocean to protect some fish. I can't remember the name of the fish.
Hmm.
And our point was, regardless of your views of California's water management, and I'll specify, personally, I believe it's terrible. It's almost criminal, and the people of California should do something about it. Regardless of your views about California's mismanagement of its water, it's undeniable that when the federal government seeks to intervene because it doesn't like the outcome of the state's choices, well, that's not federalism. I understand why people would want to do that. I
Hmm.
certainly do. If you feel like the Looney Tunes that are controlling my state are ruining it, somebody please help me completely get why you would hope the federal government would help you. And maybe that's best, but we can't call that federalism.
Right.
So part of the federalist the federalism arrangement is that states, and I would argue communities, um, are as free as possible to be as dumb as they want, as long as you have freedom of entry and exit and you're protecting fundamental rights of people, fundamental individual rights and property rights. um, then let states and communities learn what doesn't work.
Mhm.
And the rest of us can learn from their experience. And of course, vice versa, so we can learn what does work. So, and then you want maximum free speech as well. So anyway, that's how I would think about any of these states is uh, they they may be run very poorly, but that's a matter of state management. And that's where our state groups, right, their work is so very important. But our long-term bet is, even though you're going to end up with bad state and local policy quite often because people are misguided or they don't have the right philosophical underpinnings or whatever it may be, you're just going to get that. It's just part of the package of federalism.
Mhm.
In the long run, the whole system learns faster and better. And, as long as people have freedom to vote and speak and move, you're going to trend towards better policy. But when you empower the federal government to come in and say, I don't like how your state's doing stuff, like the Trump administration wants to do in California, totally get it. But you're creating a precedent,
Mm.
right? You're creating a
Mhm.
channel where people have an incentive to get power in Washington to fix, as they see fit, stuff in the states. And we've just had 4 years of some of the worst of that. And I don't think we want to continue to perpetuate it.
Right. Well, one of our largest audiences is of people within our network working on all these different state-based groups, um, who I imagine would find this scorecard very helpful. Can you point out any examples of network groups using the scorecard to further their policy goals or in any way?
Yeah, and I'll be careful because we are, at the start of legislative sessions, we're in conversations with various groups in different states, and they're talking with their lawmakers. And I don't want to, you have to be kind of mindful of that process and not
Sure.
short circuit it. But a great example, in fact, I'm going to be on a podcast this evening with our friends at Sutherland in Utah, because they've embarked on a whole, because of the scorecard, they began a project last year to do a systematic evaluation of the state's relationship with the federal government.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of support for that in Utah among their voters, among their legislature. And so we were just proud to help with that where we could. And so the scorecard was a jumping off point for them. And they just did a deep dive on a lot of that stuff to better understand what are all the rules of the game here in Utah that are affecting our autonomy, and where does the federal government have undue influence. So that's a great example. Our friends at IRG in Wisconsin, they did a similar study. They looked at one element of the scorecard, which is super nerdy. So of course I love it. It has to do with something called state implementation plans, which are the plans a state develops if it intends to comply with some big federal law, but wants to tailor that implementation to the state's specific needs and realities. So what we look at is a couple of big ones related to the Clean Air Act and administration of Medicaid. And what we're looking at is, how are those state implementation plans subjected to regular legislative review and oversight? Because what happens is Clean Air Act comes out, right? And your state says, you know what, we don't want to just follow blanket, the everything the federal government says. Let's create our own plan and get approval from EPA. And then we can take into account the specifics of our air environment
Hmm.
and do this more cost effectively and so on. And so you put your plan together. It has to meet the requirements of the law. EPA, if they're run well, they bless your plan. Your legislature signed off on it, and your governor, you're in business. Well, EPA doesn't stop making additional rules and interpretations of the Clean Air Act, and all this stuff can affect your state implementation plan. And if your legislature just signed off on it years ago and never thinks about it again,
Hmm.
there's a distinct possibility the federal government, in cooperation with your unelected state officials,
Hmm.
is making substantial changes that you don't even know about. And so that's one of the things we looked at. Well, our friends at IRG, who are so good at understanding how each of their state agencies operates, what rules of the game it follows, they are just exemplary in their knowledge of agency by agency in Wisconsin, what the heck is going on. So we're excited to see that kind of nerdy interest, being engendered in other states.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like the two groups that I'm seeing are those state groups, and then there's the state legislators. You showed me perfect examples. But I'm curious now, is it what about Joe Normal, like someone like me, normal guy? Is that something that is there a use that I have for a scorecard, the federalism scorecard?
Well, what we'd love is if somebody sees it, they're excited about it, and they're concerned, like, oh my, why does my state get such a bad score? And they look at it and go, oh, I didn't know that this happens. I didn't know that there's no legislative check or oversight on federal grant acceptances. I didn't know that our state agencies and universities spend this much lobbying federal agencies with no requirement that they report back to the governor or the state legislature on what the heck they're up to. Just that awareness, then you can do our job as citizens, right, is to
Hmm,
petition our government, call up your state rep and say, hey, I think you ought to look at this,
that's cool.
and
That's
see
really
what they say.
cool.
Call up the local newspaper because I think has some interest with local media that still exists. It still exists, in some communities. So you can sort of evangelize it. You see if you can get some interest in your state.
Well, I love it. The local media thing really brought me back to you and your book, I, Citizen. I read that when I first started here at SPN. Really
Did they
loved it.
make you read it? Was it required?
It
Like you got
wasn't
to.
required. And full disclosure, SPN sent me like 3 or 4 books, and I started like a good little. I like reading, so like a good little student that I am, I started reading all of them. Yours is the only one I finished, Tony.
Excellent. Okay. Well, this
It,
shows if you got the right competition, you can always do well.
No, there's a lot you have a lot of competition with books on my shelf. So it wasn't just from lack of competition, I can tell you that. I really loved it. And that you have a lot about your background and how you grew up in that book. But for our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up and your background?
Oh, well, sure. I grew up in North Carolina, which is where I am now, the middle part of the state, city called Winston-Salem. Spent a number of years living in Florida, however. Um, let's see, and I think, what might be relevant, which I mentioned in the book, was, a key influence on I didn't know it at the time, but I guess you might say my political philosophy as it was forming, because, we pick up, we all imagine we're so original, but we pick up a lot of our beliefs about how the world works from those around us. And then you couple that with a strong desire to not be ostracized by our community, we commit to those beliefs.
Mhm.
Or unless we're one of those people who wants to leave all you know, the dummies we're growing up with behind, and then we just commit to some other tribe's beliefs just as faith.
We
And
moved to Los Angeles and we have a far, far more strict group belief there. Yes.
yes, yeah, I've seen. So I'm human like everybody else, and so there was that. But one of those people, my mother, uh, who was really pretty passionately liberal, but old school liberal, didn't trust big federal government agencies, didn't trust the military or intelligence agencies in particular. She'd uh, come of age during the civil rights movement, and was well aware of what the FBI had done to Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists, and never that agency in particular, always viewed them as a criminal enterprise. So she had some strong opinions about those things, but also pro-labor union, uh, pro-worker, et cetera, and didn't trust big corporations, big hospitals, even though she was, well, because she was a nurse, she absolutely didn't trust the medical profession. So I just learned a lot of those kind of sharp views from her, with also a fair amount of passion. And because I was her son, I like to argue with her, so I just adopted the anti stance for whatever her pro stance was. So I learned to always be in protest of something, and learned, I guess, from her to be really uncomfortable if I'm in a big group of people who all agree.
Mm.
To really try to figure out what's going on here, because um, probably shouldn't be that way. So yeah, I just sort of, I guess I grew up deeply Protestant in every definition of that term, uh, through that, through that process, naturally contentious and cantankerous, uh, intellectually. And, that I, so this project now was probably honestly born out of anger. The
Hmm.
more I thought about and read about these things, I found myself agreeing with my mother, and I always hated bullies, even though I was the littlest kid in my classroom, including the girls, at least until seventh grade. And finally, there were some smaller, girls who were smaller than me. Um, I never could back down from a bully, even though I
Hmm.
was going to, smacked around. I just something switches, and so that's the lens, very primitive, intellectual lens, I'm sure, through which I view a lot of these federal agencies and their behavior now. They're simply bullies,
Hmm.
and I don't like them, and they're
Hmm.
predatory in that regard. So yeah, I guess if you can blame my mother for all this. So that's what I do.
Well, you have a political, like you mentioned, a political science background in college and grad school as well. Was that what you were thinking of doing, going into politics? Is that from a very early age you saw them as bullies and you're like, I'm going to get into this field and clean up house?
No, it was more selfish than that. I just, for some insane reason, after undergrad, I was thinking, well, I'll go to law school, um, because I like to argue. And I had a professor at University of North Carolina, political science professor, and I always liked him. I took all of his classes, and I guess he tolerated me because I like to argue in class. At least I was awake. And he said, "Look, law school would just be a waste of your intellect. You're a natural fit for graduate school." Well, that's all I wanted to hear, like flattery, So I applied to a few grad schools and got in, and I didn't know what I was doing. I just thought, oh, I'll just go argue and write books and be a professor. It looks like fun. You get to stay on campus the rest of your life, and then all the, kids will have to sit around and listen to my ideas. It was all just kind of a self-serving notion of what that lifestyle would be like. And that's why I went to grad school. And yeah, I didn't have any like deep intellectual path I wanted to pursue necessarily. And I was fairly unread. I was not, compared to a lot of my classmates coming out of Ivy League schools, you know, I'd coasted through undergrad. I read like half the books. I didn't really have to study that hard to do pretty well. So I just missed a lot of those opportunities in those early years to be deeply read,
Hmm.
and paid for that all through grad. I'm still paying for it. I'm still paying for it. Yeah.
Well, it
Don't
seems
squander your time, kids.
seems to have worked out okay. Tell me, so you were thinking about going into education, and you started off as an adjunct professor, didn't you?
Well, I was just doing that while I was finishing grad school. So I was in the University of Michigan for graduate school,
Hmm.
and just down the road is Eastern Michigan University, and
Mhm.
they always needed adjuncts to
Hmm.
teach their kind of intro level poli sci classes and some other classes too. So, I could have my own office. I had sort of a teaching schedule that once you have your coursework prepared, which I'd done as a teaching assistant anyway for the same kinds of classes when I was at U of M, it wasn't that hard, and I sure could use the money and the benefits. So I did that while I was piddling around trying to get my dissertation written.
And then take me from that moment to joining the movement, joining this what do they call it? The Liberty movement?
If they had called it a movement when I was doing all this, I wouldn't have joined.
It doesn't strike me as something that you would have, the contrarian that you are.
Yeah, movement implies concerted, unified, intentional action. I don't think that describes what this is, thank God. I'd been
A
like,
true Protestant that you are. I love that, Tony.
yeah. Uh, I've been radicalized, you might say, by Institute for Humane Studies. I I'd never heard of them. I like to argue and I was contrary. And so, as an undergrad, if you're contrary, certainly then, absolutely now, you tend to find yourself associated with the right because you're surrounded by people on the left and they're the only ones you got to argue with. Uh, so somebody slipped a little promotional flyer from IHS in my mailbox uh, in the dorm, and I'd never heard of this group. What I saw was I'm invited, all expenses paid, week in DC to read and hang out, and it sounded better than home. So I they had to write an essay explaining what thinkers have informed your philosophy or something like that. That I didn't have a philosophy, but thankfully, the flyer, the design was basically names of philosophical thinkers: Descartes, Rousseau, Locke, Rand, or I don't know if Rand was on there. I don't want to besmirch their flyer, but or associate it too ideologically with, well, you know what I mean. I can't remember what the names. All I knew was they gave me all the raw material I needed. So
Hmm.
I just crafted some essay that just threw those names in there. And then I added a little frisson at the end by mentioning, also Karl Marx, because he has some, thoughts we should take seriously about the structure of capitalism, blah, 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 something. So I got into the IHS Liberty Society week-long seminar. Fast forward years later, when I was working at Mercatus, we had back office, we shared all the back office support with IHS. We were co-located on the GMU campus. And I was curious, like, who who recommended me all those years ago? Like, what professor? Because generally it was faculty who would supply the names of, interested or potentially useful students to IHS, and IHS would send these invitations and stuff. So I went over to the IHS side and said, "Can you look this up and just tell me? I'm just always been curious. What professor recommended me?" And they did some looking and they came back and said, "Well, you're so old that our records don't go back that far." So I don't know to this day what angel put the flyer under my door. But after that Liberty and Society thing, they sent me home with a big box of books, Murray Rothbard and everybody else you can imagine. And I devoured all of it and marked it all up. And then I was like committed to the cause, fighting the man, and the man was everywhere. So I
Hmm.
was for a while like an annoying anarcho-capitalist libertarian, et cetera, et cetera. I just had a lot of fervently held but loosely grounded beliefs. And so I guess that's how I entered the movement, you might say. And that relationship with IHS, they supported me in many ways.
Hmm.
Undergrad, I would win like an essay contest and get some money or whatever else. They helped me get an internship for Fred Smith at CEI, and that was a great summer and learned a lot with him working there. They just kind of gave me these opportunities, and the the last and probably the most important one was when I was in graduate school finishing my dissertation work, I thought anyway. I was invited to a seminar for other, PhD candidates preparing to go on the market, held by IHS. And it was to kind of give us preparation on how to give a job talk, like make your pitch for your research
Hmm.
with faculty where you're trying to get hired, and et cetera, et cetera. But they also had Charles Koch there
Hmm.
because he came to talk about market-based management. And so I listened to his speech. And then afterwards, I mentioned to someone, Jerry Ellig, who passed a few years ago, who used to be at IHS Mercatus. I mentioned to Jerry, well, this market-based management stuff sounds interesting. I'd be curious to see whether it actually works in practice. So
Hmm.
there's that word again, practical. It was so arrogant of me. And so he decided that was grounds for getting me to come interview at Koch. Um, and so I got a call to come out to Wichita. I already had an offer at that point from the Harris School at the University of Chicago, which was my dream job because it was just an eclectic faculty, truly free speech, no groupthink, like everything. Live in Chicago, which seemed kind of cool. You know, not survive on much money.
Mhm.
So I only went to Wichita for the interview, uh, truly, so I could brag about it to my classmates and professors that I had a private, like industry corporate interview, you know. So that was really the only reason I went to Wichita. And I went out there. I met with Charles and some of his people, and he was truly the smartest person I'd ever met.
Hmm.
Like he really like shook my brain up. And then they offered me a job, and I figured, well, I can always go back to university later. You know,
Hmm.
I want to dig in here and see what the heck they're doing. And that began the odyssey of working with Koch Industries and being privileged to have a lot of time one-on-one with Charles to learn a whole heck of a lot of stuff, and try to help him articulate the market-based management philosophy um, better for their employees and others. And that just kind of led down the path to where I am now. So there you go. You can edit that as you see fit because that was a long biopic you just got out of me.
That was deeply fascinating. First question I have coming out of that, one of the jobs that I have here at SPN is to monitor our social media. And you said the big boogeyman word that you said was Coke right there. Social media is definitely not friendly to that name. Can you tell me, can you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about this guy? You said Charles Koch was his name, and what was he like? And what you said he was the smartest man in the room or the smartest man you've ever met, and he shook your brain up. How did he do that?
Well, he uh he just kind of described their philosophy, how they think about the the principles that undergird a free society and how there are opportunities to replicate those principles inside a firm to spark a similar sort of entrepreneurial undertaking to, as much as possible, um, help the employees behave, think like entrepreneurs, like owners. And of course, there's some analogs. You can't do it exactly. And honestly, you don't want a company of 50,000 entrepreneurs. You know,
Hmm.
you need some people have got to handle the operations and follow the process.
Hmm.
But there were still so many opportunities they were finding to engage the brains of their employees and give them genuine investment in their work, which was like a liberation compared to so many. You know, we've seen now at this point movies and TV shows about how awful it is to work in a big office, and they were breaking all that up. And you know, he asked me about how I think about discovery, or you know, what is like what really turns me on intellectually. And I talked about the moment of discovery when all the pieces that you know in some way belong together, but you couldn't figure out how, suddenly your brain makes them all fit together, like solving a puzzle. And he said, "Oh, well, you just described Michael Polanyi's process of discovery." And I didn't know who Michael Polanyi was, so I went straight away to I think it was the Borders bookstore in Wichita to buy Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge, which is a brilliant book, by the way, and very hard to get through, but worth. Uh, he just was shaking he was throwing in concepts, philosophers I hadn't heard of, ideas I didn't occur to me you could apply them that way. And they were building something, they continue to build. I thought, yeah, I should be here, if they want me. And, I was lucky enough they offered me a job. So I got to learn a lot. The social media, all that stuff, like the way I think I've understood that, um, Charles and his brother, like their father, um, where they were outspoken about freedom. And their father uh, had been an engineer, developed some like really cutting edge refining techniques. And at that time, you had an oligopoly of oil companies in America that were abusing the patent system and the legal system to maintain their power. So when he wouldn't play ball with them, they just tied him up in court to keep him from doing business. and he didn't have anywhere to work. And so this is when the Soviet Union was modernizing. So he went to the Soviet Union and worked with their engineers and helped them build things. And eventually he won all of his court cases in America, except for one. And it turned out later, I think it was Standard Oil had bribed the judge. So people went to jail. But he was free to do business in America. He comes back to America, begins building Koch Industries. Not long after that, he began to hear about the engineers he'd worked with, their families, their children being liquidated during one of Stalin's purges, because anybody who had contact with the West, Stalin was this vicious, paranoid thug. And so that was really formative for Fred Koch to understand this is an evil system bent on destruction with no scruples. And, we need to be vigilant about that. And so he became a really strong anti-communist, and his sons learned a lot of philosophy at his feet. And that was how you had that magic where you had Charles, who understood engineering, had advanced degrees, understood business, but also understood sort of the philosophy of freedom. And it was in that brain of his where he put them together. How do we apply the principles of freedom inside a firm? And that was the sort of the magic. And I think because of that outspokenness, and they were such key investors in so many institutions we take for granted now in the freedom movement, he became for the left what George Soros is for the right, like the shadowy behind the scenes billionaire who's engineering all of our defeats. It's just what you do as a tribe is you need a bête noire out there to blame for all your woes. And that's what I think the left did to Charles.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the one-to-one analog that I created. I'm coming in completely new, didn't know anything about this liberty or freedom movement, or and so listening to everything that people say on social media about SPN and the Koch brothers, that's exactly what. Oh, okay. George Soros, Koch, same thing, just different
Yeah.
faces. So you jumped in to what it seems like, if I'm going to pare it back or try to pare it back, what he was building was um, he was building this idea of freedom within the confines of a company which should, like, traditionally was not free. You think of a factory, you think of a large corporation, you think of a bunch of widgets and gears. And he was building the idea of how this huge corporation could actually rise up instead of enslaving its employees, make them more fully realized individuals. Is that what he was building?
I mean, that wasn't his goal. I mean,
No.
he believes in
Okay.
human freedom, but he didn't, he set out. I mean, I remember challenging him in my interview. I think I threw like, what was it, Alfred North Whitehead or whoever, some philosopher at him, like, well, um, do you want to be on the side of truth with all this market-based management stuff, or are you really looking to have truth on your side? And he says, well, we want to make money. So for
Hmm.
him, it was like, how do we make the business perform better?
Okay.
But it was just the realization, well, one reason it performed well is we got all these people, this local knowledge that our rules don't let them use.
Hmm.
And so he would come to this example of you might have an operator at some refinery who's gotten all the cues from the engineer for this particular product, right? Because not all oil is the same, right? If you're running, you get oil from different places, it has different kind of compositions and viscosity and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to run your refinery equipment differently. And so the engineer, right, at headquarters would see, all right, here's the chemical composition of this particular batch we're going to run.
Hmm.
Send orders out to the operator, run at this, trays in this array, at this temperature, this pressure, blah, 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 blah. Well, Charles's point was that operator in Pine Bend, Minnesota, understands when the weather drops below, freezing, that these valves don't work the same. And so you've got to make some adjustments to get the result you want.
Hmm.
And so they would, allow for that kind of local knowledge that
Hmm.
when you add it all up, there's so many examples. They're just harnessing people's brains. And I saw firsthand when you did that, people got engaged and their work began to mean more to them. And that to me was the great humanizing accomplishment of that system, even though, of course, it began. They wanted to make money, but they really created a more, I would say, humane, not perfect, but a more humane way to run a big enterprise.
I like that you said, I love that response. Well, we're trying to make money because I don't trust anyone that doesn't say that like very clear. It seems to be more trustworthy and honest to say, "Oh, we're trying to make money." That gives me a little bit more comfort. So take me from that point to where you are now.
Yeah. And I'll just clarify too. When he said that, I believe what he meant was, yes, I have my philosophy, but I'm not going to pretend to see the world in a way that verifies my philosophy. If it doesn't work,
Mhm.
with some money, I know my philosophy doesn't work.
You're
Uh,
going to adapt that
yeah, yeah,
philosophy.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So, yeah, I worked in the company for a while. Then I worked for the Mr. Koch's foundations. And that led me to a job with Mercatus, which Mr. Koch had started. He and some of his people at George Mason and really built that econ department there. And so I got an opportunity to go work there for a while, came back to the company for a while, worked, various engagements with organizations in the nonprofit world that the Kochs had started in some way and invested in, wanted to see perform well. And I was trying to use that market-based management stuff along the way. Um, and that kind of ran its course. And then I, was contacted about a job at SPN. They wanted somebody. The SPN had had all this growth, and they realized our operational systems need to catch up with it, strategies need to catch up with it, and it seemed like I might be a good fit for that. And our boss Tracy Sharp uh, called me up, and we talked, had a number of meetings, and I had done some other work with SPN, so I was a known quantity. And she offered me the job, and yeah, I came here and I never left, So that's
Beautiful.
that's the story.
It seems like quite a journey there. Do you recommend that? So there's going to be young people that want to be making a difference in their communities, or see problems like you did that that might think that they can present solutions. Do you think that the path that you had is one you recommend, or what do you recommend for young people that see problems and want to try and fix them?
Um, yeah, you can't follow somebody else's path. And we also have to remember, the term career, its origins are the same as the term careen, to bounce about aimlessly, which often describes a career. It describes mine in some respects, that there was no certainly human hand guiding any of it. The counsel I give to young people, believe it or not, I've had a lot of conversations with younger people over the years who want my counsel, which just shows you how misguided the youth really are. But what I encourage them to do, I rely on um, a bit of wisdom from one of my favorite writers, who has meant a lot to me over the years. He passed a few years ago. His name is Frederick Buechner. Um, and he said that your vocation, so we have career, which is bounce around, vocation, which is rooted in the calling,
Mhm.
right? The Latin word for calling. Your calling, the place to which you are called, is that place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. And so what he counsels then is understand, when you set aside all the distractions and weaknesses and sins and everything that might keep you off the mark, when you are at your best as you were crafted to be, and you feel this sense of worth and purpose, like, yes, this is what I was made to do. When you feel that, pay attention to when you feel that, and then look around and ask, where is me having this feeling because of what I'm doing best serving the hungers of the world? And of course, hungers of the world, he didn't mean the things that we consume unto our death, right? He means the things we're crying out for, even if we don't know what their names are. So that to me always made the most sense. And so my counsel for younger people is start to take note of what gives you deep gladness, and try not to put it in vocational terms.
Mm.
Just put it in plain English
Mhm.
terms, and that'll begin to inform you. And if you don't know, like I remember lecturing some students at MIT. The only reason I say MIT, you don't have to know where I was lecturing. It was just so I can brag it was at MIT. But the point was really bright. Like I never could have gotten an MIT. They probably shouldn't have let me walk on the campus as, just who I am. But they were really talking about super smart, highly motivated. And we talked about this, and one of them raised her hand and she was pretty brave. She said, I don't know what deep gladness means. Like, and then others nodded. We had to have a conversation about, well, how do you begin to understand what gives you fulfillment? Because that was not a language that many of them
Hmm,
seemed to be speaking. It was a
hmm,
language more of accomplishment and duty, maybe
hmm.
success. Those are the things they've been told to aspire for. So we had to talk about how do you discern what gives you gladness. But anyway, that's what I would think about because, and I tell my own sons, like the world is full of people who will direct your path if you don't have one.
Mhm.
So you got to listen to the voice inside. That's what Buechner talked about, and begin to practice that discernment over your own life.
There's a deep sorrow in that these young people don't know that what is deep gladness. I think you speak to that. That seems like a very story-centric sorrow. I've ordered your book, the We Shall Not All Sleep, that just came out. Um, I'm looking forward to reading it. And when I first watched you posted an excerpt of it, of you reading it on YouTube, and that just like from the first sentence, I thought, oh,
Yeah.
Flannery O'Connor, Wise Blood.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
is it a gothic? Am I right in where it's headed? And it seems to be a deep sorrow in it. And what are you speaking to with that? And I'm sure I'm going to find out more when I read it. So give me a little preview if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, Flannery, like, there's no Hazel Notes in my novel. She was always more ruthlessly on guard against sentimentality than I am.
Hmm.
So it's a similar milieu.
Hmm.
She talked about the Christ haunted South. Um, so that's there. There's, if you grew up in any kind of church, especially in the South, you will recognize what's happening, even though there's no overt religious talk, other than they go to church and they
Hmm.
talk about that stuff,
Hmm.
the way people talk about the church. So, yeah, I guess there's a gothicness in that there's dread, there's revenants, that some of the dead have come back or coming back. There's tragedy and brokenness and that kind of thing. So I think Flannery, she was always trying to break through uh, people's sensibilities,
Mm-hmm. She's
especially
trying to
the group.
break you. When you
Yeah,
read
she
Flannery,
does.
she's trying to break you.
And she will break her characters to get through to you.
Mm-hmm.
So what I had to learn is I don't want to break my characters. I've never liked Quentin Tarantino, for example, his work because there's a perversity there, there's a sadism there, and I always wanted it to work out for my characters. I didn't want to create them just to abuse them
Mm-hmm.
the way he does. But then I also learned along the way you have to give, as one of my writing professors said once, you have to give your characters their civil rights, um, so that you have to let them do what they would do for them to be real. So there's not the book doesn't have all happy endings, um, but it does have at least some good people who are trying to have a good ending. And so then part of the story is, well, do they or not?
Mm-hmm.
But you'll have to tell me if they do.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, I'm sorry, we're over time, but I still have so many questions. I'll start to wrap it up. Can you tell me any of your hopes and goals that you have there at the Center for Practical Federalism?
Sure. So we built these tools, many of them informational to help state and local officials begin to understand what federal agencies are doing, and tools to help them understand what they can do in response to those federal agencies when they misstep. So now a lot of the work is for many of us, we're just out there meeting with state and local leaders, often in conjunction with our, SPN think tanks, to try to evangelize this stuff. And then we've begun to think about it in terms of a ladder of engagement. How do we offer opportunities for these potential federalism champions
Hmm.
to do the right thing, and help them along in ways that are good for them and their people, so that they become more used to thinking in terms of their responsibility to protect their communities from federal predation.
Mhm.
And that to me is the proper term, even though it's somewhat dramatic. And how do we support them along the way? And then most importantly, how can we begin to bring them together? Because we don't want to be at the center of it. How can we be the Obi-Wan Kenobi to all the Luke Skywalkers out there who can be federalism champions, and then bring them together so they can inspire each other? So that to me is the real key. And that's why it's rooted at SPN, because we're a network. That's how we think and
Mhm.
act. And we have all these state partners. So that to me is the exciting thing for this year and next year, is the building of that community and then empowering them to do the right thing.
Beautiful. Well, folks, if our listeners want to find out more about Tony himself and the books that you've written, visit tonywoodlief.com. But Tony, how can we find out more about CPF and the scorecard?
You can find the Center for Practical Federalism on the SPN website, or if you just Google Center for Practical Federalism, and then there's links to all our stuff, the scorecard, our federal guidance tracker, American Habits, which is the kind of web zine that Ray Notestein has been building for
Amazing.
us, who's our editor there and our colleague at SPN, which has a lot of great stuff on how to do federalism, like all the things that you've got to be doing as leaders in your communities for federalism to actually work, because it's more than just a legal fight. It's a cultivation. And so there's a lot of nice work there. So you can find all that if you just Google Center for Practical Federalism.
Beautiful. Well, Tony, thank you very much. Sorry to keep you over time. I hope that we get to continue this conversation at a later date.
I'd like that. Thanks for having me, James.
Wonderful. And thank you all for joining us here on Neighbors in the Network. Thanks for listening to Neighbors in the Network, an offering from the State Policy Network. We hope that this podcast can serve as a place for empathy, understanding, and human connection. Please let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks again.